All right, chapter 13 is about meiosis. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of the semester that one of the things that I'm going to do is kind of skip a lot of this stuff about the cell so that we can really get into genetics. Because some of the most complicated labs we're going to do this semester are based around genetics. I want to make sure we're just moving that up a little bit in the semester to make sure, hopefully, that we get through those labs in person. And then if we need to come up with something from home, I'd rather do some of the more boring labs. So there's a few things where we'll kind of have to think as we go along, what kind of things have we not necessarily talked about cells. But actually, as I've been looking through this material, I don't think it's going to be that hard of a jump. So as we're looking at meiosis, this is our kind of entrance into genetics here. So as we look at this family, you can see the family resemblance. And it's totally true, right? Offspring resemble their parents more than they do unrelated individuals. Now, every once in a while, there's, that freak occurrence where you look totally different. But for the most part, right, you can tell. So when we talk about heredity, we're talking about the transmission of traits from one generation to the next. Variation is demonstrated, right? None of these kids look identical to either of their parents. And so this variation shows up as those differences in appearance that offspring show between their parents or siblings. Genetics is the scientific study of both heredity and variation. Now, children don't inherit actual particular physical traits from their parents. It's actually genes that are inherited. Now, genes are the units of heredity and are made up of segments of DNA, right? Genes are passed to the next generation by the reproductive cells, so the gametes, sperm or eggs. Now, in asexual reproduction, a single individual passes all of its genes to its offspring without the fusion of gametes. Essentially, what you get is a clone, right? A group of genetically identical individuals from the same parent. In sexual reproduction, two parents give rise to offspring that have a unique combination of genes inherited from the two parents. And so there's trade-offs to both sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. The movie that you're watching before class, we'll talk about that, and we'll talk a little bit more in class as well. So when we look at human cells, so somatic cell, the term somatic refers to basically a body cell. So sex cells or gametes, right, are one thing. The rest of the cells in your body are considered somatic cells. They have 23 pairs of chromosomes, right? So here is a chromosome, right? And you can see that it actually has what are called sister chromatids. So it kind of looks like a little X, and then its sister, sorry, I did that wrong. Its homologous pair kind of looks like a different X. This is what always confuses people, right? You are what is called diploid, meaning that you have two copies of each chromosome. One was inherited from mom and one was inherited from dad. And so if we think about this as, well, it looks like chromosome 1. Here is chromosome 1 from mom. Here is chromosome 1 from dad, right? You got two copies. This is kind of neat. This is called a karyotype. This is an ordered display of all the pairs of chromosomes from a cell. And so under a microscope, a doctor or a geneticist could actually look at this and look for any genetic abnormalities. And so you can actually see all 22 kind of somatic chromosomes, and then you also have that sex chromosome. So this looks, it's a boy, right? Because it has an X and a Y chromosome. Okay, so just to be clear on the terminology, right? If you have two copies of chromosome 1, it's called a homologous pair, right? They're the same, homo, same, a homologous pair. On each of those chromosomes, they have a sister chromatid. Terminology. I don't make this stuff up. Okay, so try to keep those straight. That's one thing that students often find, and I sometimes find confusing as well. Okay, so when we talk about chromosomes, right, this is just another way, more of a cartoon version now to look at the same thing. So here there are, pointing out again, those homologous chromosomes, right? So one came from mom, and there's the two sisters, and one chromosome came from dad, and there's the two sisters. So I think what confuses people is you're like, okay, there's, one from mom, one from dad, and it's this sister thing. So basically, in the cell, before it's going to divide, it's just made an identical copy of that chromosome that it inherited from a parent, right? And it just goes, okay, now I have two copies. That's all the sisters are. And again, the term here is diploid. So what you'll see is anytime you see this 2n, it's referring to diploid. And so in this case, if they're saying 2n equals 6, it's because, so that would be n equals what? 3. N equals 3. They're just telling you, hey, we're really just want to show you an example here with 3 different chromosomes. Right? So look for that in questions. If it says, n equals 4, draw a picture, n equals 4, it would want you to draw 4 chromosomes. In the human, right, n is 23. So you actually have 46 chromosomes, 23 pair of chromosomes. Okay. So in the human life cycle, the only time that we actually, I don't even know if we exist, in some sort of haploid form is in the gametes. So again, eggs or sperm contain that single set of chromosomes. That's your haploid cell. So here you have the sperm, and it says N instead of 2N. The egg, N instead of 2N. Those are haploid. But this makes sense, right? You need to cut your genetic information in half in order to match up with the genetic information from the other parent so that you don't have a mutant child, right? If you wanted to pass on all your genetic information, right, all 46 chromosomes, and your partner wanted to produce, donate 46 chromosomes, you're not going to get a child with 46 chromosomes. It's going to have 92. And there's like extra eyes or something at that point, right? It doesn't work that way. And so what we're looking at in this chapter is this process of meiosis. How do we go from being a diploid organism to having a haploid gamete to only pass half of that genetic material? Half of 46 is 23. So you're still passing 23 chromosomes, but you're not going to pass both pairs. You got to choose. Is it the one I got from mom or the one I got from dad? Which one's going to the offspring? And you don't get a choice. We'll talk about that. Okay, so then when sperm and egg get together, that's fertilization. We go back to being diploid. We call that the zygote. That zygote's going to undergo rapid cellular division. By the time baby's born, sorry, that is skipping on me. By the time the baby is born, right, you've got billions of cells. Okay, I'm not going to go into great detail on this, but I did want to point out that what humans do does not mean that that is what all organisms do or that it's the best way to do things. And so over in this first image, we see that this is how sexual reproduction occurs in animals, including humans, right, where two haploid gametes undergo fertilization. You get a diploid zygote, which turns into an adult. And then that adult at sexual maturity needs to use meiosis to get a haploid gamete. Other organisms are strange. I shouldn't say that, right? So in plants, for example, they go through what's called alteration of generations. And so here, this is the weird thing. They have a haploid multicellular organism, right? So actually, when you see moss growing on the forest floor, it's actually a haploid organism. That plant at that point only has one copy of each chromosome, right? You can then get fertilization. The diploid multicellular part, if you've ever looked up close, right, it's got a little seed head, they call it the sporophyte. It's not really a seed head, I guess. That is the only part of that organism's life cycle where it's a diploid, right? So it's kind of the opposite of us. Anyway, and then fungi and protists do some crazy stuff over here as well. There's more than one way to skin a cat. There's more than one way to do the life cycle. Okay, so what we really need to focus in on here then is how meiosis works. How does it actually go about taking that diploid number, 46, and cutting it in half to 23? Okay. And so what we're going to see are two consecutive cellular divisions. We're going to get meiosis 1 followed by meiosis 2. So those two cell divisions result in 4 daughter cells, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. And each of those are haploid. They have half as many chromosomes as the parent cell, right? Can we all agree that this parent cell has 2 chromosomes? Okay. Notice that each daughter cell only has 1. Now, the other thing that happens in meiosis is if you're dealing with, more than really a pair of chromosomes here, you are going to see variation. Notice that these daughter cells are not genetically identical, right? They actually are different than each other. And so that's where we get variation. Okay. One other thing I should say before we go on, notice up here this talk of interphase. So basically that is most of how the cell spends its time doing cell things. It's not until this very specialized portion where we undergo meiosis, the cell division. And so what they're trying to point out here is that in interphase, before the cell divides, we're going to go ahead and take that chromosome we inherited from mom and that chromosome we inherited from dad, and we are going to replicate the DNA. And I know that's confusing, but we're just making a copy, right? Those 2 sister chromatids are now this so this is a chromosome, but once it's duplicated, it's still just called a chromosome. I'm sorry. Okay, let's take a look. So there's that interphase, right? So we're getting the chromosome duplication. We will talk about that in the later chapter, right? It's just DNA replication. And now we come to this part where we're actually going to go through these divisions, right? So meiosis 1, here's the key thing. In meiosis 1, it's the homologous chromosomes that separate, right? So notice that dad's DNA, now it's grandpa's DNA, goes to one side and the DNA inherited from mom goes to the other. In meiosis 2, it's the sister chromatids that separate. Now, in each of meiosis 1 and meiosis 2, we're going to go through 4 phases. So we've got prophase, metaphase, anaphase, and telophase. And so we're going to look at meiosis 1 first, so it's prophase 1, metaphase 1, anaphase 1. But the nice thing is they basically repeat themselves with a couple exceptions. So here is meiosis 1. So a couple things that happen in meiosis 1. So in prophase 1, a couple key things here. Notice our homologous chromosomes are hanging out together, right? So call this chromosome 17, doesn't matter, right? From dad, and chromosome 17 from mom. They actually are going to fuse together, right? So they form what's called a tetrad, like 4 tetra, or sometimes it's called a bivalent, but the homologous chromosomes fuse and they do what's called crossing over. They will actually swap some of their genetic material. So like notice here in future pictures, now this is mostly from dad, but there's a little nubbin from mom. And that all happened back in prophase 1. They swap genetic material. This is wild. And it's actually really important for variation in the offspring. Okay. Also in prophase, notice we get these what are called microtubules. So the centrosome is this, I don't know, I guess you could call it an organelle, that is going to, they move towards opposite ends of the cell and then they put out these protein microtubules, almost like shooting out spider webs that are going to then attach to the chromosomes. So the centrosomes are starting to move to opposite ends, and we also see the nuclear envelope fragment and fall apart. And this is actually going to allow us to get in, grab the DNA, right, which for now has been kind of secluded in the nucleus, and we're going to be able to pull it apart into two daughter cells. Now, in metaphase 1, the chromosomes end up along the midline. That's always how I remember it, metaphase, midline. So those microtubules, those proteins, those little spider webs came out and they start pulling on the chromosome. And since both ends are yanking, eventually all the chromosomes end up down the middle of the cell. It's called the metaphase plate. Okay. In anaphase 1, we're going to break the bonds between the homologous chromosomes, and they're going to start to move to opposite ends. So it's literally these proteins are shortening, and they're like dragging the chromosome away by its little waist. Okay, so in anaphase 1, we start to see them separating. In telophase, they've moved to complete opposite ends, and we actually start getting two separate cells. Cytokinesis, cyto is the prefix for cell, and so this is where we actually see the division of the cytoplasm happening. Okay. Notice at this point, we now only have one copy of chromosome 17 in this daughter cell. Our cells are now haploid. So meiosis 1, crossing over occurs and the homologous chromosomes separate. We have two daughter cells that are each haploid. Let's look at meiosis 2. Okay, so now we're starting with our two daughter cells, and the centrosomes are going to go to opposite ends. The little proteins, the microtubules, come shooting out, and sure enough, in metaphase 2, they line up along the midline. In anaphase 2, as they start to separate, this is where it's actually the sister chromatids, right? So these were sisters, and now they're getting drugged to opposite ends of the cell. We are going to see telophase when they reach kind of the opposite poles, and again, cytokinesis is the cell division. So now we have 1, 2, 3, 4 daughter cells that are still each haploid, right? So that is meiosis. You actually take one stem cell and you turn it into 4 sperm. In females, it's interesting because you end up, it's still the same process, but the egg is so much larger and actually needs all of the cytoplasm and all of the organelles that each time you go through this division, it's really lopsided, right? So meiosis 1, most of the cytoplasm goes to one daughter cell and the other kind of shrivels up. It's called polar body, and it gets discarded. So really females end up making one egg and 3 of these like polar bodies that get tossed, where males can actually turn each stem cell into 4 sperm. All right, so what we're going to do when we pick up in class, we're going to talk about any of the problems you guys are having with this. It is complicated. If what I'm saying isn't making sense, use other resources. Check out Khan Academy, Crash Course Biology, but we'll have some time in Zoom to go over this. Your textbook publisher has an excellent video. We'll go ahead and play that. And then I also want to talk about this idea that sexual reproduction is super important in regards to getting variation in offspring and why that's important. So we'll also talk about the movie you watch. Do make sure you check out that PBS documentary, because what else do you want to do on a long weekend but watch documentaries? And we will see you in Zoom on Wednesday. No lab this week.